Hello and welcome to Tilt Astrology. Here's a video about what's likely to happen from March 2026 until March 2027. It's a weird one. Before I begin, a few housekeeping notes. I think I finally solved my microphone problems, so this video should sound much better. I'd also like to say, as I do in most videos, that astrology is an art form based on how the ancient cultures understood astronomy. There are a ton of rules and significations that have developed over time. The astrologer's job is to try and take the rules and meanings and put them together to make some sort of judgment about how things are lined up in the sky without introducing personal bias. As an astrologer, it's going to be remiss of me to state things as if they are categorically correct, because astrology is very complicated. I've done the best with this that I can, and I'll tell you what I think the chart is trying to say to everyone. The ascendant sign is Taurus, and this is a fixed earth sign. Technically, only one chart should be required to cover the entire year, according to William Ramsay in his 17th century book on astrology. You can watch my separate video for an introduction as to how this works. However, having looked ahead to 2027, it's such a radically different chart that I'm going to try and use Abu Mashar's technique of monthly revolutions to see if I can find when things start to spin off into a different direction. I'm making the 2027 astrology predictions as a separate video though, because again, there is a lot to get through. As the ascendant sign is Taurus, this makes Venus the planet of the yearly chart. And Venus is in the 11th house next to the moon. By the way, the last video I used Ramsay's exact definitions, referring to lords and ladies of the year, but I'm going to be referring to these more neutrally going forward and bring it into the 21st century a little. So planets of the year rather than lords and ladies. As always, I've set the chart to the spring equinox. As a sidereal astrologer, spring occurs in Pisces, as per the astronomy, not Aries, as per tropical astrology's Northern Hemisphere seasons-based approach. Venus is exalted in Pisces, and this means Venus is in fantastic condition. This is a very fortunate position, and it can indicate that the year is going to bring success. There are a lot of advantages for the nation, and Venus indicates that the year will go well. However, Venus is in a stellium, and a stellium is 3 or more planets together in the same sign, so this complicates things a little. Despite being in good condition, she's also wedged into the sign with others, and in Vedic astrology, her ruler, which is Jupiter, is not a fan of Venus. The first thing to notice is that Saturn is combust with the Sun. So this could be thought of as the Sun obscuring our view of Saturn, meaning that Saturn can't function at full strength or express its significations. This brings its dynamics to the ruler of the nation in the chart, which is the president. There are some interesting things going on with the aspects of Jupiter in both the yearly revolution chart and the inauguration chart, and I'm going to discuss those in more detail regarding the nation's finances later in this video. Finally, the moon moves between signs very quickly. We can see here that the moon in the yearly chart is in direct opposition to the moon in the inauguration chart. So the moon's going to move into Aries within a day, which means the moon would then be ruled by Mars, which is up in the 10th house and represents the government. Venus gives me the impression of what I can only describe as kind of a bread and circuses type situation. This is about the appearance of everything being good, but if you take a little closer look, it's not good. The chart is a blend of fixed and mutable, also called double-bodied signs. So Sun, Saturn, Venus and the Moon, along with Jupiter, are in the mutable signs, with Mars, Mercury and Rahu, also called the North Node or the Dragon's Head, and Ketu, also called the South Node or Dragon's Tail, in fixed signs. So there's no cardinal sign involvement, and that means there's no forward movement in this chart. It's a variable situation, but the government tries to keep the situation as is with no changes. Jupiter, representing wealth, financial stability, and purchasing power of the nation, is overcome by almost all of the planets in the yearly chart. So there really isn't a chance for Jupiter to prevail here, especially as it's in a superior square, which means it's in a 10th house relative from another planet. So this also applies in the inauguration chart. In terms of fixed stars, Sirius is within 1 degree of Jupiter. So Sirius is a royal star and it's fortunate, indicating fame and wealth, but also pride and danger through being impetuous. It's also associated with summer-related outcomes such as fires and drought. This could offset some of the problems with Jupiter, but as its signification shows, it's a mixed bag depending on the condition of the planet it's closest with. The Sun, which represents the ruler of a nation, in this case the president, is with the people, represented by the Moon, and also Venus as a representation of the people's overall condition. And the Sun is conjunct Saturn, so the president is bound to the people rather than being concerned with the 10th house, which represents the government. The 11th house is about income, gains, future plans, and friendly international alliances, which we can view with different lenses as we analyse the chart. If we look at it from a government perspective, we have a couple of things happening. As already mentioned, Saturn has combust the Sun. So Saturn here may struggle to bring in any of its significations into the picture. There's nothing particularly beneficial or malevolent from Saturn as it's hidden by the Sun. On the malevolent side, this is good, but on the beneficial side, not so much. Saturn always brings in the element of hard work. So in the inauguration chart, Saturn represents what is expected of the president in terms of hard work and restraint. The president just doesn't seem to want to be in work mode here. In this configuration, there is a sense of a lack of discipline, as the Sun can kind of do what it wants here. I mean, it's in Pisces, which is kind of a weird sign anyway, but it's also a mutable water sign. So the Sun is kind of out of its element a little bit here. So in this configuration, Saturn really isn't there to rein things in. And, you know, Sun is an enemy of Saturn, and Saturn and Sun are both in Jupiter's sign. So this is like an easy way out for the Sun. It's not dealing with its enemy anymore. It's overwhelmed it. It doesn't have to care. But Pisces does bring kind of a weird dynamic to the Sun. The Sun is in Jupiter's sign, which is essentially a spiritual sign. In natal astrology, in mundane astrology, it's losses and finances. So it's not quite where it should be. The problem is that although the president is having a good time, the 10th house is not in good condition. In fact, it's in bad condition. The 10th house represents not only the president, but the government in general. Others, represented by Mars and Mercury, along with Rahu, are in the 10th house, and they're running the show, essentially, not so much the president. Saturn rules the 10th house, and we've just talked about Saturn being unable to provide any guidance here as it's overwhelmed by the Sun. The planets in the 10th house can essentially do whatever they want. Rahu in this configuration lets people get away with mischief. If the astrology is correct, then the president's job is to keep the people in a good mood. That's kind of all his job is. There may be an appearance that the economy and nation itself is just fine when in fact it's not. And this is going to be subject to some big changes. Going back to Saturn, Saturn is friendly with Mercury, but it's not friendly with Mars. Saturn is deliberate, moves slowly, it can be about delays. So it's not a fan of the pushy, go ahead at all costs action of Mars, but it's a little less upset with Mercury. However, Mercury is retrograde once more and is in conjunction with Rahu. It looks like those who are in control of the wealth of the nation, along with the rich and elite, are sort of in agreement with the government advisors, not so much with the people or the president. This could indicate the continued stripping of money out of the economy. This seems especially relevant with Mars in the 10th house. Mars is a malefic in this state and represents extreme hardship on the people in the form of taxation and cruelty. It also represents the military and police, perhaps hinting at something a little darker in terms of control over the people. I think upon reflection, I should also update the signification of Mars to a more modern interpretation. Astrologers have given the additional significations of computers and technology to Mars. So based on 2025, we could also say that potentially some sort of technology is being used to keep control at the beginning of 2026. A Mercury in a reasonable condition would show that the advisors to the heads of state and entrepreneurs would be honoured by the president, but Mercury is in retrograde here. So whoever these people are, they're not being honoured by the president, perhaps because at this stage they just don't care. Again, Mercury in retrograde also represents that the advisors or whoever they are not thinking in a particularly logical or smart way. We also have Ketu in the 4th house in Leo. This also tends to show poverty and scarcity. The moon represents the people along with the ascendant planet, which in this case is Venus. This is because the people represent the overall health of the nation. Saturn can also represent people involved in labour or labour-related jobs, such as agriculture. And if we were to view this with a lens of that particular aspect, then we can say Saturn is relatively obscured here. So those involved in labouring jobs just aren't very visible. Neither are unions or union-related activity. The moon is very close to moving into Aries here at this point, as I've already mentioned, which would place the moon into the 12th house, which is just, it's not a great house. The 12th house also represents instability and dissension for the moon while it's being ruled over by Mars. So on the good news side, the moon is now visible again and it's waxing instead of waning, so it's gaining back some power. Venus follows the moon out of Pisces in April, indicating that this is good fortune and alignment of the people with the president is great, but it's also probably very short-lived. So before Venus and the moon moves into the 12th house, we also have this pile-up directly opposite the inauguration chart moon. So again, we have this indication of opposition beginning to form in the chart, and not mild opposition, but serious opposition. The finances of the nation need their own special section in this video because there's actually quite a lot going on. As already mentioned, there is a superior square affecting Jupiter in both the inauguration chart and the yearly chart. Mars is also in the mix with a trine down to the yearly chart Jupiter, but a square to the inauguration chart Jupiter. So the yearly chart Jupiter is close to Mars in the 3rd house, and this again emphasizes problems with communications between the government and the people. Pisces is ruled by Jupiter, and in this chart, Jupiter is in Gemini. So this is a place it really can't stand, as Jupiter hates Mercury. Jupiter is a mutable or double-bodied sign, much like Pisces. So part of the problem with double-bodied signs is that they're very changeable. So Jupiter prefers doing more spiritual stuff, or at least being optimistic, and Gemini is about intellectual pursuits. Gemini and Mercury are considered to be what's called persuadable, so they're neither benefic or malefic, but they can be influenced by whatever is around them. In Mercury's case, in the yearly chart, this is Mars. In the inauguration chart, it's still Mars, as it's in opposition to it. So here Mercury acts as a malefic rather than a benefic, especially with Mercury being retrograde in the yearly chart. So Jupiter is overcome by all of the planets in the yearly chart, which really clobbers Jupiter. It just can't be as beneficial as it would like to be. In this case, we have a Jupiter seesawing from one extreme to another. Jupiter isn't totally malefic here, as Jupiter always tries to express its beneficial side, but it's struggling. So this may be showing there are concerns with the nation's purse, or at least where that money is invested. But at this stage, there's nothing to rein this in. So on the surface, there appears to be great wealth, but the reality is that there probably isn't, or it's built on a house of cards. With the square setup and the trine up to the government, it may be that people feel the lack the most, but the rich and elite don't feel any lack. The 7th house shows open enemies to the nation. This means that we know about them. This is represented by Scorpio, which is ruled by Mars. This brings in the people who are represented by Mars, which is the police and the military, as already mentioned, and it also represents technology such as computers. More importantly, it brings the 10th house into the picture as well, indicating that those enemies are in the government. Private enemies, those the public don't know about, but the government or the president does, is represented by Aries, which is again Mars. Both private and open enemies are represented by this planet. Mars rules the 12th house here, and it's kind of teetering on the edge in terms of what type of opposition it would bring to the people, if any. Secret enemies are ones that neither the government, president, or people know about and are represented by the 9th house, which is 12th from the 10th. In the yearly chart, it's Capricorn, showing those represented by Saturn are the enemy. So the enemy is pivoted here from Mercury in the previous charts. Saturn can't do much here and really can't do any harm. Prior to this, it showed the enemy was from an advisor to the head of the state or an entrepreneur connected to wealth in some way. But this has now changed, perhaps indicating that a formerly secret enemy is known and out in the open, and this is representing a pivot to something else. I said in my last video that by the start of 2026, it looked like the astrology was indicating that the US would have lost most of its allies for whatever reason. The US seems to be alone for the most part by the time we get to spring 2026. The 9th house shows overseas concerns and missions. And again, Saturn can't do much here. There's really nothing for it to do, and it's not able to do anything anyway. The 11th house is friendly international alliances, which seem to be in a detente, or at least no one is threatening anyone. It's just all very stuck or currently of not much concern. As I've already mentioned, there's a lot going on in the 2027 chart, which I'm going to cover in a separate video. So the question is, how do we get there? Using Abu Mashir's method, I've tried to get a view of what happens from month to month, although this is at odds with William Ramsey's advice not to bother if the sign of the year is a fixed sign. So I've broken this up into chunks so we can get a sense of kind of 6 months at a time. So from March 2026 until around July, there are rumblings around the law, legal matters, income and money, as we've already talked about. And the problems with the nation's wealth becomes increasingly clear by around May 2026. And there's a big uptick in disease around the nation. And so there will start to be more, not so much propaganda is not the right word, but there's an uptick in the amount of communications from the government about the state of the nation, which basically is going to tell everybody, it's okay. July seems to be pretty quiet, and then August appears to indicate that there's actually people trying to leave, and quite a few of them, and fortunes are evaporating for everyone. It's not just the ordinary people, it's also the richer people in the nation. From September to December, it kind of suddenly flips on its head. People seem quite opposed to the government, and the sun is suddenly by itself. So maybe there's a hint of betrayal, but, the president is alone for whatever reason. It becomes increasingly clear that there are problems with the government, and people and the government start to clash a little. From December to March, that's when it becomes increasingly unstable. The government is on shaky ground, also the astrology seems to indicate. So this is possibly leading to an end in some way. Possibly some members of the government are trying to communicate from overseas. And just like everybody else, the rich and the elite have nothing to hide behind because their money is going south as well. So just to recap, the people and the president, or whoever is in charge at this stage, from March 2026 appear to be initially bound together. So I think moving into March 2026, that's the situation. Like there's a temporary peace. The people, for whatever reason, are in agreement with the government, and everything kind of seems okay. The president's confident, thinks everything is under control, so he's probably more inclined to playing rather than working. Government advisors or entrepreneurs, along with the military, police, or technology, have control over the people. There is heavy taxation at a minimum, and it just continues to be a theme of wealth extraction from the people that's going to the rich and, by extension, the government. And the rich and elite are kind of okay with this at the moment, at the start of 2026. But as we've talked about, that kind of starts to go south. There is a possible bread and circuses component where the government attempts initially to kind of placate people with superficial solutions to what is potentially a serious financial crisis. Justice and legal recourse seems to have disappeared, or it's severely curtailed. Things, as I've talked about, kind of start to go wrong in the later half of 2027, and then kind of February 2027 sets everything up for that next year, which I'll talk about, as I said, in another video. I also just wanted to add a little bit about Donald Trump's natal chart and his solar return charts. So he has a very powerful chart, and that Mars is always in great condition. It's always in its sign or in the sun sign. And it kind of always bails him out. So it's rare for him to have a year that doesn't kind of work in his favor eventually. So looking at solar returns, like his 2024 solar return, as expected, it's pretty solid. It's actually very, very good. It's very powerful. Combined with his natal chart means, he's the president. 2025's looking pretty good as well. And interestingly, that 2026 period from June, which is when his birthday is, that chart is not so great. I mean, Mars is pretty solid, but there are some planets in not great condition there. So I usually use the solar return to kind of add some additional layers to the chart. But I'll cover his chart and Elon Musk's chart, once more in a separate video. So that's it from me at the end of this depressing video. And I always like to say I could be wrong, of course, and things could be wonderful for the entirety of 2026. And it could actually be indicating that lots of people are getting wealthy, or at least experiencing a rise in their living conditions. But that really does seem at odds with the condition and positions of Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, and Saturn, and that general setup. So anyway, I hope to see you for my next video. And if you've coped with this one, I hope you will like and subscribe.